Hello, everyone. I thought I'd do a quick video on the status of the Russo-Ukrainian war as of January 14th, 2023. I think this is an interesting turning point, not only because of some of the recent changes around Solidar in the Bakhmut area, but also because there's a lot of chatter on YouTube, Telegram, so on and so on, especially on the pro-Russian side. I think a lot of people engaged in a lot of wishful thinking that there's going to be a big Russian expansion of offensive operations sometime in the near future during the winter. And I'm making this video mainly to explain why I think that is unlikely. So to kind of sober up everyone's expectations here for the next, at least I would say, 4 or 5 months of the war until we get to, May or June, when the weather maybe starts to dry out and you get to a summer uh, season where offensives are possible. And I also think it would take another round of at least partial mobilization on a scale similar to the 300,000 that Russia did back in last fall in order to really, enable, a big expansion of offensive operations of a very ambitious form that people are expecting. And I'll explain why that is in this video. So, concerning that 300,000, and of course the number could be slightly more, that's just the official number that Russia said it had mobilized last fall, or that it had called up for mobilization. And I think as of about a month ago, they said that, the troops were all mobilized and we're in the process of training and equipment. So, the timetable does match up in terms of right about now. I think those forces would be ready to engage some sort of offensive operations. But I don't think those forces were necessarily slated for that. And let me explain why. So first off, I've read some sources claiming that roughly 100,000 of those 300,000 that were mobilized were not really even intended as a net increase to Russia's manpower in the theater. That they were meant basically to facilitate rotations and to make up replacements for personnel loss. Now, I'm not saying that Russia has lost 100,000 troops. I'm saying that maybe some small fraction of that, who knows, maybe 5,000, 10,000, were killed and wounded, especially in the months. There was some tough fighting in Kherson, in, even though, Russia in Kherson and in the Kharkov counteroffensive, did put a priority on retreating and evacuating its troops and maintaining its manpower. I don't doubt that there were some losses, but the vast majority, of this, we're talking about facilitating rotations, because a lot of these forces, had been, involved basically since the start of the special military operation. I know that Russia had been doing some rotations. There's some video of some units, returning to their hometowns throughout, last summer. But I don't doubt that a lot of units were due for another round of rotations. In any case, I find that 100,000 claim plausible. So we should maybe right off the bat deduct that from and say that there's really only maybe 200,000 net increase in Russian troops being added to the theater from this partial mobilization. Okay, which would put Russia's forces at about 400,000 total. Is Russia started the special military operation, quote unquote, with about maybe 200,000 troops, especially if you count also the Donbass militias, which now are theoretically, integrated into the Russian military more or less officially. So, and then if you want to add, maybe 50,000 from Belarus, if Belarus is going to get involved formally, which I don't think they will for reasons I'll explain, maybe you're looking at 450,000. Okay. Also, a lot of these troops, even of that 200,000 net increase to the theater, we're likely talking about shoring up existing defenses. Okay, especially in the Svatova, region where Russia was, being pushed back. Their defenses seem to be much firmer now. They seem to have some operational reserves to respond to Ukrainian attacks, like around Crimea. So, Yeah, I don't doubt part of that net increase is just going towards purely, defensive intended tasks. So there really aren't, there isn't this huge pool, let's say, of 200,000 troops that can be freed up, just for a purely new offensive operation. Okay, keep that in mind. There may be even as few as, let's say, 100,000, freed up because you need, Russia's manpower obligations are going to be less in the Kherson region now that they have the Dnieper as a natural barrier. So maybe there doesn't need to be any net increase at all in this region. They can leave those manpower levels as they were, but they do. I don't doubt they are firming up the Zaporozhye region, because that would be disastrous if Ukraine were either to drive towards Melitopol or Berdyansk. Um, that would put Kherson and even Crimea in some serious jeopardy. So I don't doubt there's been some forces out of that 200,000 increase assigned to that, and some assigned to the Svatova region, and maybe some even assigned to the Bakhmut region. It's hard to tell, how much of this Bakhmut push is, due to the, actually, I'm down here, is down to, the, exceptional capabilities of, the Wagner and VDV troops that have, allegedly come into here. So how much of it is just that Ukraine's getting exhausted, Russia is inherently, more capable on a troop by troop basis, on a one-to-one basis compared to Ukrainian troops, or are we seeing the result of maybe some reinforcements being put into this area? I don't think Russia's putting a lot into this, because if they were, then there would be reserves available now to really press the advantage much more quickly than we're seeing. We would see Russian troops really taking several miles per day, maybe one town per day, if there was just a big reserve of, let's say, 50,000 Russian troops, waiting here, maybe waiting here in Popasna, ready to spring into any gap that had formed. Because Ukraine, for a couple days especially, I think Ukraine's had some time to maybe form up a new line of defense, behind Soledar. But, for a couple days, things sounded very panicky on their end. And if Russia had, let's say 50,000 troops ready to plunge in, maybe in some sort of campaign to swoop around here and isolate Seversk, that would have been the time to do it. So I don't think, there's a huge, net increase of, Russian reserves in this region. Of course, some may also be going down here to Klishivka, because there seems to be some progress here that people aren't really, paying attention to as much. Soledar is getting all the headlines, but this also looks really concerning for Ukraine. There's even some reports from the Ukrainian side that there are some troops kind of in the region of Protechny. I don't know how to pronounce that. I'm sorry. Now maybe that was just a reconnaissance, group, that then pulled back. But Klishivka and its fortifications, seem to be kind of in some dire, under some dire threats. Some may have already been taken. It looks like there's this fortification area to the northwest that's still holding on. But once again, if Russia had huge reserves, now would be the time to throw them in. Get to Ivanivsk, really seal the lid on any retreat from Bakhmut. Which makes me think that there hasn't been a huge net increase of Russian reserves devoted to this region, and maybe for good reason. Because at the end of the day, maybe you can push the front line forward, with some reserves. Those reserves could probably have an even bigger effect in an area outside of the Donbass industrial region. Many authors have talked about how it's inherently kind of slow going in this region due to the fortifications, the urban environments, the rivers. So long story short, how much of that net increase of maybe 200,000 is actually, has actually already been spoken for. I'd estimate even possibly as much as 100,000 of that, or maybe 50,000 at the very least, just to firm up defenses. So that maybe leaves 150,000 total of the original 300,000 that could actually conduct new offensive operations. Okay, yeah, open up a brand new front, so to speak. And some people are expecting this to, be directed in a march towards Kiev. Some even talked about, going way west towards Lutsk. Some people are drawing these big arrows, saying, oh, they could drive all the way to Moldova and Transnistria. No, I don't see that happening. I think more realistically, something that Russia could bite off, that wouldn't be more than it could chew, would be something much more limited in scale, like and I think something which would, personally, if I were in charge, something I would recommend is maybe a drive here to reclaim the Oskil River bank. Okay, because a tendency we've seen throughout this war is Russia seems to want to constantly decrease the scope of operations, the geographical scope of operations. Okay, what have we seen from the very beginning of the war? It started out with basically 5 different, theaters. You had, basically northwest of Kiev. You had this kind of Chernihiv Sumy region. You had the Kharkov region. You had the Donbass Zaporozhye region, and you had the Kherson region. And continually, Russia has been actually kind of paring back the extent of its, geographical extent of its offensive operations. Partially because I think for the manpower issues, they just literally couldn't, afford to be fighting in these, different fronts that were unsupportive of each other, where they all had different flanks, independent flanks they had to protect. And keep in mind, if you have an unsupported attack or salient, the farther you drive in that salient, your flanks basically, triple in size. Let me show you. So if you make an initial salient, let's say like this, do it as a square box, just as a demonstration. At the very least, your flanks are going to, almost double in size. Let's say if you just, increase the salient to like that. But in practice, you want to widen the salients, or else your supply lines will become ever more, vulnerable, tenuous as you go forward. So, all 3 of these directions need to, get, the salient needs to become wider as well as deeper as you go on. So, so for a given distance, you're basically looking at a 3x, amount of front you need to protect if your salient is unsupported by neighboring fronts. So people are talking about a drive from the Belarus-Ukraine border all the way to Moldova. You're talking about what is that going to be, like 500 kilometers? Let me tell you, the only way that is going to be possible, even against the Ukrainian army, which, Ukrainian army is not the best in the world. It's also not the worst. I think Russia and many people underestimated Ukraine at the start of the war. I think it would be foolish for the Russian government to underestimate them now. So you might say, oh, Ukraine's on its last legs. Do you really want to bet the whole farm on that, though? I'm not saying that Ukraine are some super soldiers or whatever, that they're, super well equipped with Wunderwaffen, from the West. But even so, to do a drive, from Belarus to, let's say, Transnistria, and just to, protect the flanks, to do occupation duty, to do everything that would be needed, you'd need something like, 1 million troops, like something like, what the Soviet Union devoted to, Operation Uran, to surround the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. 900,000 troops, 1 million troops, something on that order, even against the current Ukrainian forces. Even if they outnumbered, let's say, Ukraine, 5-1 in this region, they'd still need like 1 million troops, just to deal with the logistical, because you're not going to be able to do a pencil thin, salient all the way, bridging from, from the Belarus border to Transnistria. That's just not how these things work. Okay, so and even to get to Kiev, I think you're looking at really, to be safe. I, as a Russian general, wouldn't want to commit anything fewer than maybe 300,000 troops, on this thrust to Kiev, especially if you look at military land and its deployment map. Of course, I'm not going to take this as gospel because it'd be very unlikely for all of this information to be reliable, open source, available to the enemy and the public. So I don't know where they're coming up with these figures, but if you just count up, the brigades and regiments and battalions around the Kiev region, let's say each brigade is about 5,000, 2,000 for regiment, 1,000 for battalion. So we've got 5, 10, 12, 13, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 47. You're looking at almost 50,000 troops in this region around Kiev. And, right off the bat, the troops that are going to be engaged offensively, you want to have a 3-to-1 advantage just to be safe. So the Russians would need 150,000 at least just to take on these troops. But the thing is, once the Russians start making a salient towards Kiev, they're going to also be drawing in, attacks from these other, forces. So, in reality, I would at least double that, to be safe. I would use no less than, let's say, 300,000 troops to drive on Kiev. Okay. And that's, number one, I don't think Russia has that manpower, available for that. Because like I said, not all of that 300,000 in partial mobilization was, a net increase in manpower. Also, I don't think even capturing Kiev would necessarily end the war at this point. I think it would have if the initial Russian drive on Kiev in the first week had done so, because the shock value, at that point, you could almost kind of tell in the media, Western governments, NATO governments were kind of hesitating. If you go back and look closely at the first few days of media coverage, yes, there were condemnations and whatnot, but there really wasn't this full-throated call to action to support Ukraine by any means necessary until about the 4th or 5th day, when it started to become apparent that the Russian forces were not making much forward progress after that point. I think if Russia had, by that point, managed to secure Kiev, the NATO governments would have been presented with a fait accompli, would have been such a symbolic shock to Ukraine itself. I think there could have been, forcible change in government. Whereas now, I think the Kiev government could flee, to Lviv, whatever you want to call it, or, to Vinnytsia, or, somewhere else, and, carry on the fighting. I think most of the Ukraine armed forces would follow them, would continue the fight at this point. There's kind of a sunk cost fallacy, which, by the way, also helps explain why Russia is not going to give up the fight anytime soon. There's a lot of pro-NATO wish casters who are expecting, the Putin regime to crumble any second. No, that's not how these things work. Russia's magnitude of engagement is on a similar level to, let's say, what America, was engaging in, let's say, the Vietnam War. If you compare, the personnel involved as a proportion of their population, how much of a pull or a drag on their economy it is, we're looking at a roughly Vietnam War level of, commitment to the so-called special military operation. And if anything, the at least for Russian audiences, the cause of the war on Russia's side is, I would say, even more kind of direct and plausible, where it's happening right on their border. It's involving some people who are plausibly pro-Russian or Russian speakers. I'm not saying that that's necessarily a fully persuasive cause, but it's a bit more of a direct cause than the America's cause in Vietnam, the so-called domino theory that communism might spread if this, South Vietnamese government falls to the communists. And even in that case, in the Vietnam War, it was persuasive enough to, basically from 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, all the way up until, the early 70s, to sustain, 500,000 American troops, in Vietnam throughout that period. So we're talking, 6 or 7 years. So at the very least, I think, there's at least 4 or 5 of those years, up until 1968, the Vietnam War was not particularly controversial among the mainstream of American opinion. Yes, some people were griping about how it needed to show more progress or whatnot, but as far as calling into question whether the cause itself was worth it per se, and not just how you're going about pursuing the cause, you don't really see, big cracks in the American mainstream on that issue until, after the Tet Offensive in 1968. So I would say, Russia has probably at least 4 years or so of relatively controversy-free, political capital, as we might say, to prosecute this war at the current magnitude of engagement. Obviously, if Russia demands more of its citizens, it may force that issue sooner, and that's maybe why it is kind of walking around on eggshells and not really doing a full, mobilization as of yet, because they think that time is more on their side, that Ukraine will not be able to sustain its level of commitment for, let's say, 4 or 5 years. And then even after that, you may see controversy start to brew in Russia, more questions about the war, but that's not necessarily, when the guillotine is going to come down on Putin's, neck or whatever, it's not when, necessarily the deadline for when the regime will fall. That just means it'll start to become more, question, unless there's, significant progress by that point. So, is the Russian government really particularly in a hurry to show geographical progress, to end the war, to deal a decisive death blow by, even if seizing Kiev would do that? I don't think that's how the Russian government sees things, just judging by their actions and the way they seem to be going about this war so far. I think a lot of, internet commentators want the war to be over with sooner, not only to preserve human life, but also, this sort of psychological uncertainty of following the war, maybe some people being invested on one side or the other and wanting to see that resolved one way or another. Almost, it's like that scene in Return of the King where Pippin says, it's bad enough to be in the middle of a battle, but to be on the edge of one that you can't escape or that you're constantly anticipating is even worse. It's kind of psychologically fraying to, just see things drag on indecisively. But, the Russian government knows this, and just as, difficult it is for pro-Russian people, let's say, to watch this unfold in this way, it also has to be difficult for Ukrainian, pro-Ukrainian people to watch this, and difficult on their morale, and especially Russia's emphasis on kind of artillery duels, and just, where a lot of Ukrainian troops never really see a Russian soldier because they never get close enough to them. Their experience of the war is just being shelled by 8 or 9 times the magnitude of Russian shells than they are able to send over in return. And that's extremely demoralizing. A war that consists mainly of sitting in your trench or foxhole and enduring shelling and knowing that you're only able to send back maybe 1/8 of the volume of shells that you're receiving, and just always wondering, gambling, is this next shell going to land on me? There may be a certain logic to the way Russia is conducting this war, minimizing its manpower losses, doing retreats to maintain, manpower and minimize casualties at all costs, trusting in, that time is on its side, that it can let this go on for 4 or 5 years if need be, and that, Western governments and their will to supply Ukraine, as well as maybe even Ukraine itself, that their will and commitment to the cause will crack before Russia's does. So, I don't think Russia's government is in any particular rush to do some bold gamble like, going straight for Kiev. So not only do I doubt that they really have the means, but also the motivation. Now, more about the means to pull this off. People are talking about a big troop buildup in Belarus. And of course, the Russian government is saying, well, this is to deter, other people, namely Poland, from, jumping into the war. And of course they would say that in any case, but I actually buy that as the most logical explanation. Because if Russia does think time is on its side, um, then the only thing that could really, um, you know, turn the war against them is if there was a dramatic escalation from NATO. If Poland jumped in with 200,000 troops, then that would totally change the game. And I don't think Russia wants to deal with that. I mean, I think Russia in that case, would have kind of the moral, political capital to call upon a more full mobilization of its people. And I'm not saying that Poland would necessarily, win, but Russia doesn't want to deal with that if it can help it. So, I find it very plausible that Russia has, 50 or even 100,000 troops next to maybe 50,000 Belarusian troops here training and equipping and stationing in Belarus, not because they're going to drive on Kiev or something like that, but just to deter Poland and say, hey, do you really want to deal with this? Because we are ready for you, even. And of course, people can say, well, Poland would never do this. Russia has nuclear weapons. But, hope we've been over this before. Everyone's aware that Russia, can't just, right off the bat resort to using nuclear weapons on Poland. If Poland got involved, Russia would have to try to at least, deter it with conventional forces first. And only then, if Russia was losing badly, and I would say Russia would also have to, in moral terms, to justify its actions to its population. Not that it has to justify everything to its population, but it's not like the Russian government is omnipotent and can get away with anything. I think people overestimate the extent to which it's a totalitarian dictatorship or whatever. No, I mean, yes, it has some authoritarian aspects to its government, but it does need some degree of political goodwill from its people. And it would be difficult to justify, escalating to the nuclear level unless Russia had tried seriously to, to fight back Poland with a conventional force first, and maybe a full mobilization first, because once you go nuclear, that means, all bets are off and it's, kind of apocalypse. And I think Russians may be more spiritually or morally prepared for that than Western, populations might be. That is to say, there may be some genuine Eastern Orthodox, believers who think that they will be going to heaven, as martyrs in that case, and probably many Catholics in Poland as well. I don't know, whether people in Germany or France want to die for that cause. I don't know. But still, no one is really prepared. You can never be fully prepared for nuclear war. Russia doesn't want to go there, and Russia doesn't even want to tempt Poland into getting involved conventionally. So I actually completely buy, in this case, it seems perfectly logical to me that Russia would, and also it's not as if Russia is not getting anything out of this force. It is going to tie up more. It's going to keep more, Ukrainian brigades hanging around here if Russia has, 100,000 troops, let's say, in Belarus. And these are troops that don't have to necessarily do any fighting. It's kind of, they can continue training. In fact, Russia can continue rotating troops into here to do training. It can use this as sort of a training ground. So it's not as if it's a huge expense that is going to go completely wasted, if Poland doesn't do anything, or if Poland weren't even intending or thinking about, going into Belarus. There's some side benefits as well to Russia stationing in Belarus. Doesn't necessarily mean a drive on Kiev. Okay, so now that said, I do think, Russia could scrape together maybe 50,000 troops, for some sort of slight escalation, some sort of slightly increased tempo of offensive operations, if they really wanted to. And, it's possible the reshuffle recently in their command has something to do with this, foreshadows something like that. Surovikin seems to be more defensive minded, more about playing it safe. He was, the mastermind behind the, very controversial Kherson retreat. Maybe he doesn't want to be in charge of a plan that he's unsure about, if, maybe you could try to spin a story where maybe Russia is planning on an ill-advised drive towards Kiev with maybe only 100,000, troops or something like that. Surovikin doesn't want to be a part of it because he thinks its chances of success are not great, and maybe Gerasimov, is more willing to make that gamble and take the responsibility if it does go south. Although I don't think that's Gerasimov's style either. This YouTuber Weeb Union, did a very good analysis of Gerasimov's, publications and his kind of at least publicly stated, methods of warfare, and it doesn't sound like big arrow gambles, offensive gambles. Gerasimov sounds like someone who pays a lot of attention to slow grinds of enemy morale and and a sort of warfare that does not involve frontal assaults, but instead involves basically hitting the enemy without them even seeing you, with artillery, safe behind lines, and also using maneuver, but and being willing to make retreats when necessary. Weeb Union has a great video on all of that. So I'm not even sure if a big lunge towards Kiev would even be Gerasimov's style either, which is another reason why I doubt this. But I could be wrong. We'll see. But as far as if I were in charge, what would I see as a more plausible, proportional, offensive if Russia did want to, and if it was planning on doing something much more ambitious offensively in the near future? I would say there's basically two different options. I would say a thrust from Svatove to maybe towards somewhere like Borova, to split this kind of Ukraine beachhead across the Oskil River into two parts, and basically try to push Ukraine back across the Oskil River, and or if it's really successful and if Ukraine gets stubborn and wants to kind of cling on to this, maybe even, for the first time in a while, Russia could get into their operational depths and, surround some of their logistics and command and control and actually take a sizable group of prisoners this way. I think this sort of thrust of, what is this, like 40 kilometers, that this is doable with maybe a force of 50,000. 50,000 uncommitted fresh troops could make a lunge towards Borova and then maybe come south towards Lazove. If they could get Lazove and Ruptsi, then they could really threaten to cut off any retreat from this whole area of Torske, and even Liman would be put in a difficult position at that point. Ukraine would probably still try to hold it, but they'd have to set up pontoons probably across the Seversky Donets. I don't know whether these roads are very good or not. There's a lot of forest. I don't know how difficult it would be to supply Liman straight from Slavyansk. So, and I think, Russia could then also maybe drive straight from Crimea as well as a second pincher, one coming down from Borova and Lazove, one coming from Crimea to converge on Liman and retake that, which I do think is kind of needed to really start besieging Slavyansk again, to have a presence here across the Seversky Donetsk. For artillery and whatnot. So, this is something that Russia is going to have to do eventually anyways, if it really is serious about, eventually taking Slavyansk and Kramatorsk later this year, maybe, perhaps in the summer or fall. And it also would create a better defensive line for Russia. I mean, Russia has been investing in, trench works and tank obstacles and whatnot on this kind of line near Svatove, but it would be better for them if they could use the Oskil River as a defensive barrier so that they could free up some manpower from having to protect this whole front. And also, Svatove would be a better location for kind of an operational reserve to engage in counterattacks in that case, whereas right now it's kind of a little too close to the front line, for that to really function that way, as far as ammo depots are kind of, vulnerable. And it can't really, respond up here to, near Dvorchina, Liman Pershi, very well, as an operational reserve, because there are Ukrainian forces in the way. Whereas if Russia could push Ukraine back to the Oskil River, then then Savatove could and Crimea could be very effective stations for kind of operational reserves for counterattack that could easily get to any part of the front. So if I were in charge, that's what I would do. Or my second best option would be to to have a 50,000 strong, let's say, operational reserve here in the Bakhmut area to be ready to follow up with things like where Russia recently broke through the defenses in Soledar, or if Russia were to take over Klishivka, realistically 50,000 could then make a dash towards somewhere like Chasiv Yar, or go up and surround the Siversk salient. You could do that in a matter of days or weeks if you had like a 50,000 operational reserve down in this region. Some people are talking about a push from Zaporozhye, like a big maybe from here from Velika Novosilka all the way up, which originally I thought this was the plan. There'd be some sort of big pincher from Izium and from Velika Novosilka to basically surround the entire Donbass industrial area. I mean, that would be kind of a smart plan if Russia still had Izium. And also, realistically, this would take, this would be on par at the very least with a push on Kiev. It would take at least 300 plus maybe 400,000 fresh troops, devoted to operations of this scale. And I don't think Russia has that as of now. And I don't think it would make a big difference to maybe, drive to the next line and maybe take, Kharkov, and, it would take, probably 150,000 just to get to maybe this line. And what would that really achieve? I mean, yes, it would be huge progress, but would it be worth the investment? Whereas I think you could devote 50,000 for an operational reserve to either take out Siversk, Chasiv Yar, or push back up to the Oskil River. Those would be the three options. If Russia has uncommitted reserves, that's where I would put them personally. I would not, think about doing a lunge towards Kiev. I also think that would be very uncharacteristic for Russia to do at this point in the war. I think that's based on a lot of hype and wish casting, especially from the pro-Russian side. I don't see that happening. I mean, of course, there could always be just a collapse in the morale in the Ukrainian armed forces. I mean, that's always possible. And at some point in the war, that may happen, 2 or 3 years down the line. And I think it's probably more likely to happen in Ukraine than it does in the Russian armed forces, at this rate, just based on things like what we're seeing out of Soledar, where, despite having apparently a big numerical advantage, Ukraine's just, getting its butt whipped by, by the Russian forces. So I'm not here to downplay Russia's capabilities, but just on a pure numbers game, I don't think a big ambitious lunge towards Kiev or even like reopening the Sumy front. No, that's not going to happen. I would bet money against that. There's not going to be an amphibious assault on Odessa. That's not going to happen. I think that would be very uncharacteristic of Russia, based on what I think its capabilities are, what I think they think is realistic at this point, and the way they seem to want to prosecute this war. I think either something to drive Ukraine back to the Oskil River, something to maybe follow up around Soledar or Klishivka. Those would be my three options for if Russia did have an operational reserve where they would most logically want to commit that at this time. So yeah, that's about all I wanted to say. So thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree. See you later.